did my first assignment. I got somewhere and they were just like, "Hey, sorry, but we got to deploy in an hour." And then you're just out the door. And yes, your heart's in your mouth and you're nervous and you're scared. And by the way, to the very end, there were times when, I never, like, it never went away that I'm looking like fear that something's going to go bad. And especially when you work in certain environments where the locals are very good at creating cases, right? So double agent operations, dangles. You have to always know that you could be on the wrong end of a very well-planned operation.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today, I am so excited to share this combat story with a legend from the CIA spanning the first Cold War battling the Soviet Union, to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the counterterrorism refocus, and then the second Cold War with Putin's Russia, Glenn Korn. Glenn recently retired after 34 years of U.S. government service. That included time with the Army and State Department, but primarily he was with the CIA as a case officer, Russia expert, and multiple-time chief of station, some of the most important countries around the world for America's security. In this interview, we delve into Glenn's experience at the agency to include close calls, lessons learned, his command of foreign languages. Glenn's a fluent Russian speaker, and where the agency is going today, but we spend the entire second half of this interview digging into everything Russia, to include Putin's motivations, Navalny's death, the experience of the Russian people from the late 1980s until today, and what it would take for Putin's reign to finally stop and give the Russian people a just leader. Glenn is now a founding partner at Variag Strategic Consulting and an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. I am good friends with Glenn's brother Gavin, who is sitting just off screen during this interview, and who also spent many years in government service with the Department of Justice. They come from a family that has given so much to this country, and I'm so excited for you all to hear Glenn's story for the first time. All right, Glenn, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So just so everybody's tracking, we have Glenn's almost identical brother sitting off camera. It's going to be really tough for him to not comment on this, but I thought we'd start off with your transition out of government recently, but then we'll get to you and growing up with Gavin and the fam.
Okay.
But for starters, you spent a long time career in government. You're recently out. What does it feel like being out now after how many years was it?
34 years total. I've been out almost a year now, and I would say it's mixed emotions.
How so?
Honestly, I feel guilty because if you look at what's going on in the country today and around the world and the number of threats that the United States is facing, I felt guilty leaving because you could work forever. The threats keep coming and coming. The challenges are there. But on the other hand, I don't miss a lot of the bureaucracy. So mixed emotions. But and the one thing about the organization, I retired from the CIA, and that's where I spent most of my career, is the camaraderie, the people, a lot of great people. Not all, but a lot. And I miss some of them sometimes, especially the younger officers who, I felt bad leaving some of them behind.
I feel like your point on you could always keep working. I certainly felt that way after leaving, just 8 years at the agency and 8 in the Army. And I felt bad both times leaving. Were there any conversations you had with mentors or people as you were exiting to help you make the decision?
To be honest with you, not really. It was more that most of my real mentors, the people I really enjoyed working with and respected, had left. They had already made that move. And what I realized one day was that no matter how long you do it, there's always going to be a new crisis. So, for example, in 2021 with Afghanistan, the withdrawal, I felt I was going to retire before that. And then I felt very motivated not to go because, I had some experience with that issue and I thought I could be of value. And then, of course, Russia expanded its invasion of Ukraine, and I'm a Russian speaker and I served in that part of the world a lot of my career. So I said, I can't go. I just realized it's always going to be something, and there are plenty of other people that can do the job.
Yeah. Oh, geez, such a tough call. And I know the Russia background is so big for you, so I can't even imagine walking. Just before we get to your family, would you ever go back to Russia now, or you could never set foot there.
What was that? The one-way ticket? That was the song?
Yeah.
I don't think I would go back to Russia at this point. I would love to go back to Russia. You know, I would say that I really enjoyed being in Russia. Each time I was there, I have nothing against the Russian people. As a matter of fact, I have to say, you know, my understanding is 40 of them were killed overnight in this terrorist attack. And no matter who's behind it, my heart goes out to the families. You know, I like the Russian people. And Moscow was a wonderful city. If you ask my wife, St. Petersburg, where we live, was a wonderful city. So there's a lot of greatness about the culture, the people. Unfortunately, the regime is problematic in many, many ways. And we're seeing what they're doing, the atrocities they're committing, not only on the Ukrainians, and that's heartbreaking, but on their own people. So I would go back if the Russians, how would I say this? If the regime was different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get to kind of the difference between the people and the regime later, because I do want to dig into that for people who haven't had the chance to obviously spend time there. But if we can jump back, obviously you spent 34 years at the agency. You've got brothers who have also done time in service, I should say, in the government. Where does that come from growing up? Like, where does the service dynamic come into your family?
Well, first I have to correct you, Ryan. There wasn't 34 years in the agency. There was also some time at state, and I worked for the Army when I first started out for INSCOM, which I worked in a great unit with some great people. But where did the service come from? I think it was my father. When we were younger, you know, we grew up in New York. My father had been in the Army, and then he left the Army. He was a surgeon. He was in private practice. And then during the Reagan years, when Reagan rebuilt the military, and by the way, for your listeners, your viewers, the greatest president ever, in my opinion, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. The Army came to my father and asked him to go back into service, and he did. And I remember watching that. I mean, he gave up probably a much higher salary and maybe more financial benefits, material benefits to go back and serve the country. And I remember him and my mother, they went overseas to Brussels, to Mons, SHAPE headquarters, and they were very happy. And they were surrounded by great people who were serving the country and a lot of foreigners. And that's when I really got the wanderlust, the desire to kind of live overseas. So I think it was my mother and my father and the example they set. And then I had an older brother who went into the Army out of college. And I think that was a great example. So
what was the context of them bringing your dad back into service?
They needed surgeons. They needed experienced surgeons because the Army was increasing in size. And so they went. My understanding is they're doing this today for some professions as well, which I think is a great thing. So he went back. He was happy to serve again. And he served for how long? I don't know, 10, 15 years before he finally retired for good.
And you all went with him to Belgium or no?
No, it was it was one of those cases, like usually the kids move out of the house. In this case, my parents went into the military. They left us. They abandoned us. We were in college at the time.
Okay.
So, but we got to go for Christmases and during the summer. And that was this great experience. I remember Gavin, my younger brother, and I, the first time we went to Europe, we flew through Heathrow. We had tickets at the Army bought us. And I remember sitting in the bar in Heathrow, and we were too young to drink in the United States, but we went up to the bar, we bellied up to the bar, and we ordered 2 woodpecker ales. And the bartender's like, "Are you sure you want this, mate?" We were like, it was like 8 o'clock in the morning. We're like, "Yes, we can drink." And the guy gave us the woodpecker ales, and it was like the most horrible tasting thing I've ever had. It's like turpentine. But
it worked.
But it worked. And it was a great experience. I don't know. It was fun. And we found out McDonald's had beer in Belgium, right? I think we had that commented, right?
As it should,
As
yes.
it should.
And I was born in Mons, actually.
You were born in Mons.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I can appreciate this.
That's awesome.
Where did you get the itch for government service or the military? Was it this I think watching your parents?
Well, the parents, then the Reagan years, like feeling like I had some obligation to the country. And for whatever reason, I was blessed with a skill. You know, I was a Russian speaker, and I managed somehow to become very good at the language. And I felt like at the time, you know, people told me the country needs this. In the late 80s, Cold War was still going on. So I hate to say it, but I started before the end of the first Cold War, and I retired during the start of the second Cold War, Cold War 2.0.
Yeah.
But I just felt like I had some obligation to serve. And I was very fortunate that from the beginning, I got to do jobs that were really interesting, intellectually interesting, gave me the opportunity to travel a lot, see the world, and do crazy stuff,
Yeah.
which was kind of my nature.
Well, before we hit record, we were joking about your math skills, but then, opposed to some strong language skills. When did you start picking up languages? You mentioned Russian and being a fluent speaker, but where does that come up?
In high school, I was a horrible French student. I'll tell you the story. I was such a bad French student. And on the state regents exam, I think I got a 65, which just barely passing, or a 66. And when I went to college, I decided to study Russian. And the reason is, one, I didn't want to take French again. I saw the Spanish line was really long, and then I looked at the Russian line, and there was a really good-looking blonde on it, and there was like nobody else on the line. I'm like, this is the best way to meet somebody at college. So I signed up for Russian, and the teacher, the one Russian professor at the school, was sitting there, and she said, "This is Russian. Do you know how hard this language is?" I said, piece of cake, trying to be all confident. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, the young lady disappeared. She, I think, went over to German or French.
Probably to French.
And I just got hooked on Russian, and I was super motivated by it. It was hard at first, but I really was interested. Something inside of me just said, stick with it. And then I went to Russia for, an immersion in the Soviet Union at the time, and that was just phenomenal to see what you could do, like when you spoke the language and how fascinating it was. And from that point on, I'm like, there's no way I'm never going to not do this language. And I'm going to, I told myself early on, like, I'm going to read War and Peace in Russian. I'm going to read Dostoevsky in Russian and Dr. Zhivago. And I did, and it was like a great feeling. And speaking the language was really exciting. The Turks have a saying, one language, one life. Right. The more languages you speak, the more lives you have. And I was very fortunate in my career to learn multiple languages and be able to use them overseas. And it was just one of the highlights of my career.
Did you feel like when you were learning that language that this was kind of harnessing the interest that like this is your career path? You're seeing an opportunity in this space?
I'll say two things. One, I learned Russian and I became pretty proficient. And when I was working for the Army, I went through some training with the CIA. And there was a guy at the time who had been very senior in the CIA, and he was running this course. And his name was Marat. And we were talking one day on a break, and he said, "Oh, you should come over to us. Like, you have skills." And I said, "Well, if you were going to come over to the CIA, what language would you learn?" This is late 80s, by the way, early 89, 90. And he said, "I would learn Turkish." And I said, "Why Turkish?" And he said, "Because the Soviet Union is going to collapse. And we're going to need people that speak Turkic languages in all the embassies in Central Asia and the Caucasus, Azerbaijan." And I took his advice. And like that next week, I went out and signed up for Turkish classes at the Middle East Institute in DC. And I ended up serving in Turkic-speaking countries, in Turkey. I learned Turkish. I learned Uzbek. I learned Azeri. And to this day, I have a lot. Like, I just never forget that mentorship.
Wow.
And that lesson he gave me. And, once I learned Russian, like learning Turkish was not, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it was much easier. I learned Arabic later for a tour in the Middle East. And it was always fun. It was always exciting. I loved talking with people in the language. I loved just connecting with people.
Yeah.
And it was great for my career. And it was great for like our personal lives, because we got to meet so many people that we probably would never have spoken with in all kinds of crazy situations.
What happened with the French then? Was it just you didn't have a reason to learn it the way you did with Russian?
I don't mean to be like childish or base, but I remember later when my father was in Mons, key person in my life, Gavin, my younger brother, we were in Brussels one night, and we went to a disco, and there were like two good-looking Belgian women at the bar, and I tried to speak to them in French. I was like, "Voulez-vous un boisson?" Or, and this one French girl looked at me and she said, "Your French is horrible," and they both stormed off. And I was like, "Aha! Languages are important, right? You got to be able to communicate with people." So, and I have to say that because of Russian, when I, early in my career, I was sent to a place called the U.S. Army Russian Institute, which was in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And when I was there, I met my wife. And thanks to Russian, I met my wife and we got married. And, the language thing, I met the blonde later after college, but a different blonde, but much better looking. and much more patient, and another great American who put up with all the crazy tours that we had around the world.
But was also a Russian speaker.
She was not a Russian speaker. She was working in Germany for a U.S. company, but I met her at a party on the St. Patrick's Day, which is, by the way, a great holiday for all people around the world. And she ended up learning Russian when we went to Russia. And she did like amazing job of learning it without a lot of formal. She could get anything done in Russian, and then later in Turkish and in Arabic. And she always had friends wherever we went. And to this day, she keeps in touch with a lot of those people that, yeah.
What was it like being in the Soviet Union then? Since you've seen Russia in different permutations, like that first time in the Soviet Union, I can't even imagine what that was like.
What was stunning is that the people, that was the Cold War. We were the enemy. We were enemy number one. And yet the Soviet people were so kind and so open. They were curious about America. They all wanted to talk. And especially if you spoke Russian, they went crazy. People inviting you to their apartments, even though there was some risk to them. The other students, I have a lot of great stories. I'm finishing up a book I'm writing about my experiences with the Russian people and the Soviet people. And then later when I worked in the former Soviet Union, and like a lot of those great experiences. What was, the only people that in our dormitory, the only people that were not nice to us were the Cubans. There were a bunch of Cuban students, and they clearly did not like the Americans. But the Soviets were great, and it was a fascinating experience. Wow. And then going back after the Soviet Union collapsed and working in St. Petersburg in the mid-90s, early 90s, that was fascinating. The Russians were extremely interested in connecting with Americans, learning from us. My own view is there was a period where we had a window of opportunity in Russia, which for a number of reasons, including some, I think, on the U.S. side, mistakes we made.
Yeah.
We didn't seize the opportunity. And, guys like Putin, he was the deputy mayor in St. Petersburg at the time for foreign relations. The head of this SVR now, Sergei Narishkin, he was there. Yeah. And then I went back again later, in the late 90s, and I saw the change, like where the anti-Americanism started again, the kind of people saying we need a strong hand. We need another Stalin. So you could see Putin was coming. I would not say that I or anybody else predicted Vladimir Putin would be the president of Russia in 1997.
It's someone like him.
But you could hear people saying, including young people, we want someone like him. And then going back again years later and seeing what had happened and how things had changed. And in my own opinion, how Russians became politically passive because they realized they had given up their chance at kind of liberty, freedom of speech. They couldn't change. They felt like they couldn't change anything. And so they try and focus on other things. But a lot of them were frustrated because they saw their country, as one Russian told me once, our goal was not to be allied with North Korea and Iran. And that's where we are. And that was in the 2019 period.
Oh.
So, and now they're even bigger pariahs today because in my opinion, Putin has taken the country on a very dangerous path.
So you mentioned INSCOM. Why was that your first foray out of school into government?
I took a job as a clerk typist, working for the government and working for the Army. And there was a program, it was a 2-year fully funded program for graduate school and then on-the-job training that INSCOM had, and they were looking for Russian speakers. And I applied to that. There was a wonderful woman in the HR system who kind of pushed me to do that and motivated me to do it. I did it. I got that job. It was called the Defense Funded Language and Area Studies Program. And that's how I got to go to Garmisch, which at the time I was the youngest student there, maybe the youngest student to ever graduate. It was a great experience. It was a 2-year postgraduate level degree program, certificate program in Soviet military studies and security studies, taught all in Russian.
Right up your alley.
Yeah, it was amazing. And of course, it was a beautiful place, kind of like where we are now, like your neighborhood here. You look out the ground, there were a mountain like the Zugspitz. And the other students were, very impressive. They were all Army FAOs.
Mm-hmm.
So very impressive bunch of Americans. And we had one British student and one Australian. And that's how I ended up at INSCOM.
And you mentioned you kind of get recruited almost out of INSCOM to go to the agency. Is that how it worked, or did you end up finding a different path?
No, I went to state.
Okay.
And then I went to the agency. So a little bit of a different path,
Circuitous,
but circuitous. But I had an opportunity to go work for State Department and go overseas and go to Russia, and so I took it.
Jeez. All right.
Yeah.
So if we can, one of the things, before we jump into Russia itself, but really one of the things we always talk about on the show are some of the formative moments you have when you're doing this job you've been trained to do. Certainly in the agency, this can take many shapes and sizes, and obviously being very delicate with the topic itself. But are there one or two moments you remember being particularly challenging when you were in the field, operating, making decisions that you still think back on today?
All the time. Yes. That's one thing about I was just talking about my career with the agency and I was an operations officer. And I don't know that people can understand how much psychological stress and pressure that you live with because people's lives are in your hands. When you're a young officer, like you're running agents, that's extremely stressful. It's fun. You could work with really great people and exciting. It's like an adrenaline rush all the time. But there's stress. Okay, when you're in some places, you're under observation all the time, surveillance all the time. You have to be on. It's like you're an actor on a stage. And then when you're leading people, like people's lives are in your hands. When you're in the war zones, you're going out, you're rolling out to do something and bombs are going off. There are checkpoints everywhere. That's exciting. And I would never trade a minute of everything I did and the people I worked with, but that come with a lot of stress, right? And so the formative stuff, I was lucky. I worked with a lot of great leaders, people that were motivating, that had done the job themselves. They had that experience and they shared the experience. They were very honest. The feedback was very honest, sometimes brutally honest, but for me, it was a great way to learn. Probably 80% of the people I worked for in my career, 85% were really good leaders. Some were exceptional leaders. Not all of them. Some were not. But you probably find that in any organization or bureaucracy. And then other formative stuff, 9/11, seeing what happened after 9/11 and like the way people came together, working with the military, working with the Special Operations Command, working with the Bureau. That was great. It was fun.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, Bolotor, and we'll get right back to this combat story. I got to tell you guys about the Bolotor podcast. They interview the top people in the outdoors. Listen to the guests they've had on their show. Includes E.J. Schneider from Naked and Afraid. They've actually had 5 people from Naked and Afraid on their show. Jordan Jonas from the show Alone. Forrest Gallant. That guy was on Joe Rogan's show. He knows everything about the outdoors, animals, wildlife, you name it. Tons of other people from the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the Red Bull team, and much more. The host is Michael Stein, who's the founder and CEO of Bolotor, an outdoor products company. He's also an actor, filmmaker, stand-up comedian that's worked with Academy Award winners. Guy gets around. Go to their website at bolotor.com. That's BOLOTOR.com. Or just look it up on all the podcast platforms for the Bolotor Podcast. That's the Bolotor Podcast, anywhere podcasts can be found. If you want outdoor adventure stories, tips, and tricks about the outdoors, or discover things you never knew about the outdoors, and hear from the most influential people in the outdoor industry, check it out, the Bolotor Podcast. And now, back to this combat story. What do you remember from that? I'm curious, what was it like that day for you?
Shock. How can I say this? I'll never forget. It was about 3 p.m. We watched the events on TV. At first, I thought it was like a Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, like what do they call it? Like a action movie. Mm-hmm. And then when we saw the second plane hit, I was watching the TV with one of the office managers, secretary. And then, we had to get the ambassador, tell people what happened. The next day, like my boss at the time pulled everyone together and said, okay, the world has just changed. We're at war and your lives are going to change. And from that moment on, it was like a sprint for 10 plus years, nonstop work, traveling, deploying, doing like just weekends. There was no such thing. And there were periods in my life where I would feel guilty if I would leave the office and I hadn't finished something and I turn around and I go back. So I'd work like 22-hour days. But I just couldn't sleep. I'd go home and I'd be like, okay, did I miss this? Did I not get this? And then go back. It's like an addiction, a compulsion. But the people around you were doing the same thing to your left and right. That level of dedication was there. And then a lot of our, we don't talk about this a lot, but a lot of our foreign partners,
Yeah.
they worked harder than we did, and
Yeah.
they were taking greater risks than we were. So to be with them, and I was fortunate to work with some really great people who are, I don't know where they are in the world today, but I hope that they're safe and sound. But unfortunately, we lost friends, especially during the war on terror. People that were killed in raids, in operations. And that experience was amazing. Like, just talking about formative. And I look back, I was very fortunate at the period, like the government was doing stuff. Like it was action oriented. But one thing I remember, going back to your question, on 9/11, I went home at about 8 o'clock at night because my boss said, go home and spend some time with your family because it all changes tomorrow. And when I went home, my youngest son was sitting on the couch crying, and he was probably 4 years old.
Wow.
And I said, what's the matter? He said, Dad, they're going to kill us all. And my other son, I went to talk to him. He's like, leave me alone. I'm watching cartoons. So he was not as fazed. But watching like my son like that, and I have to say too, I was in, a place where the next day when I went to work, there was a mountain of flowers outside of our embassy entrance.
Wow.
The locals,
you don't see that every day.
They were so supportive, as were a lot of other people. It was a really interesting time.
Well, certainly being in a Muslim country, as that happens, there's probably a lot of questions for the family. Like, what does this mean for us? Did they have to get evacuated out, or?
No. And one of my tours after that, they were evacuated because of threats. No, we were in a place where we were hit by suicide bombings and terrorist stuff. And, my kids told me later when we came back to the States, they said, we were worried all the time. We just never told you because we were worried. I was like, were you worried you were going to die? And they said, no, but we were worried you were never going to come home.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't think about that when you're in that 120 mile an hour mode.
Yeah.
Right. You're doing your thing. But, what they went through, the sacrifice they made. And my wife, yes, she had to just pick the kids up and go. Like one day I came home and said, you got to get out of here. And we went through that multiple times. And we went through that threat multiple times. Where they just had to be ready at a moment's notice. And my wife is incredible because she never complained about it. She just did it. And, she'd complain if I left dishes in the sink. I didn't understand what that was all about. But okay. So, yeah.
Some of the guys we've had on the show have had I'd say almost misfortune of having their kids also serve in the military or in the government. Literally in the same places they either flew over or were on the ground. And universally, they will say it's way harder being the family member than the one who's downrange because of that, like the uncertainty of dealing with it. And I guess your kids are probably of age where they might be doing something crazy as well. Did you ever push them into this career path, military service?
I didn't push them. I think that they had a desire.
Yeah.
Watching that growing up, it's like our father didn't push us, but there was a desire. And I told my kids all along, you do whatever you want as long as you're happy. My father told me once, if you can be any job, as long as you feel you're doing an honest job and you're happy with what you do, don't worry about how much you make. You can make an impact no matter what you do. And I try to tell that to my sons, but what they've told me is they feel an incredible amount of pressure because of my career and my brothers, who are also very successful. Yeah. And they've served and they've done great things for the country. And I talk to my nephews, I hear the same thing from my nieces. So it's almost subconscious, maybe, which is a little unfortunate because I hate to have them have that pressure on them.
Yeah.
But I guess it's built.
It's going to help them for sure.
Hopefully.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier about the mentorship, the leaders, and the feedback and sharing. One of the big things I remember from the agency was how well, at least my impression, obviously far, far junior from your experience, but how well people shared the history, lessons learned, like brown bags, sessions in the building, in station. It was not like that in the military for me, even as an Army officer. Do you remember like what that was like, sharing, receiving? Any of those moments come to mind?
Yes. It used to be when I came in that was very important, and it was like almost built into the system. Lessons learned, case studies, talking to like the gray beards.
Yep.
Who would just
the gray beards.
Yeah. I mean, like just
Exactly.
when I started, there was like a group of ethnic Russian officers, and they would like pull me aside and tell me stuff and share stuff. We'd go outside in front of the building and smoke, and they'd tell me war stories. Unfortunately, what I saw in the last couple of years is that's gone away. I don't know if it's the same anymore. I teach a graduate level course on Russian studies, and what I see is a lot of the students just don't have the sense of history. They're great students. I love them all, but I don't know that the education system in this country is doing the country the service that it needs to do. It's my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of work to do, and I think it's the biggest national security threat facing America today is our system of education. But yes, I mean, back then it was built in, and if you like history and you're a sponge and you're intellectually curious, which is probably one of the greatest, like young people say to me, what skills do you have to be a case officer? It's being able to listen, being intellectually curious. The best officers I ever worked with were ones that they get an assignment and they just do everything they could to learn about that country, the culture, the language. Even if they didn't have a year or 2 years of language training at night, they were doing it on the weekends. I've seen a trend where that's gone away, and that's a little bit disappointing and concerning because our cultural awareness is lacking. And our ability, like we as Americans have to understand the world outside of this country is different. And we shouldn't expect everyone to speak English and think like Americans. It doesn't work that way. And when I started, it was a big deal. Like, know the history of the organization, know the history of the operations. And there's a lot of great literature written about things. One of my hobbies is I love to read all the Russian literature about like espionage, and that's fascinating. And the Russians have a lot more stuff out there available. They have YouTube channels just dedicated to the history of like the espionage, spy versus spy, usually, KGB versus CIA. And listening to their versions of things is fascinating. When you know from our side what the version is, there's probably a little propaganda going on their side, but a lot of it, like I learn stuff every day, some of the things that they did.
Have you heard any stories that involved you or something you were involved in?
Not yet, and I don't want to.
You don't want to
I'm a little
hear
bit
the
worried
other side
about
of
that. No, there is one book I read, which I'm in the book. And, I won't talk about it, but someone doesn't know what it is, but it's the story of like one of these cases and the guy's talking about me. And I wish I could tell people about it because it's kind of cool, but I can't. I can't even show my son.
Does it portray you in a good light?
It makes reference to my language skills, which made me very proud when I saw it.
All right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
That's a pat on the back.
And my what's the word? But my tenacity.
All right.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. It was fun.
All right. You also talked about having this responsibility, people's lives in your hands, not just, other officers, but obviously assets and liaison partners. Did you have any experiences where you ended up losing someone on the other side? And if so, how did you handle it?
Places where I worked, first we lost, yes. And it's hard. Especially in the CT world, it's a very, very dangerous business. And a lot of times when you're, the best way to stop a terrorist attack is to recruit penetrations of a terrorist cell. But those are people that are running around with terrorists. And, me personally, no, but people that work for me, they had to go through that, where people that they were handling never came home. And partners like in some of the foreign services that we worked with, guys killed in raids, guys that we had worked with that you had known. As I mentioned, like I was somewhere where we had a suicide bombing, 2 guys that I used to talk to all the time. Like every day I'd shoot the I can't say that.
Oh, yeah, you can.
Okay, I'd shoot the shit with them and smoke a cigarette with them. And then one day, like they were just blown up by a suicide bomber. And when I was called outside to like deal with the crime scene, and their body parts were everywhere. And I knew that they both had small children. Yeah. Right. And it's a country where they didn't have, I'm sure they didn't have a pension so that's kind of heartbreaking.
How do you, as a leader, when somebody loses maybe an asset or someone close in that chain, how would you talk to them about it? Because this is something they can't bring home, right? I mean, they can't really talk to anyone about it. Is there anything that you learned over time or that you would try to do?
Well, I'll tell you this one story. My first tour, I was going to a very difficult place, right? I can't name the country, but it's really, really difficult in our business place to go. And one of my instructors from the training, from the farm, was an older guy, not older, wiser. He was a great CIA officer, and he had moved on to another job. He was working in our headquarters. I was going through another set of advanced training to go where I was supposed to go. And one day I got this call from my instructor, and he said, hey, so-and-so, I'll say his name, Cliff wants to see you. Can you go Friday at like 6:00? I'll cut you loose for an hour. He wants to talk to you about something.
And leaving that course for an hour is no small
small thing. And I'm thinking, okay, what did I do wrong? Like I'm going to get in trouble. What did I do? So and they gave me his address, and he lived in like Northern Virginia somewhere. And I go to his townhouse and ring the doorbell, and he lets me in, and he had 2 beers, and he's like, let's have a beer. And he sat me down on his couch, and he's like, listen, I just want to talk to you about something. He said, in this organization, people don't talk about their failures. Everyone brags about what they've done, but nobody talks about mistakes they've made or failures they've had. And he goes, I want to tell you, like, I'm in the senior service. I've done this all over the world, and I've made major mistakes, and I failed. And he said, I want you to know, because where you're going, like, the pressure is intense, probably worse than anywhere else. And I want you to know, like, if you lose one day, sometimes the other guys have a better day than you do. Sometimes it's just bad luck. Sometimes they throw more resources at it. Sometimes you'll win. Sometimes you'll lose. But when you lose, you got to get back up on the horse. You can't give up. You got to be resilient. And I just want you to know, like, it doesn't mean you're not a good person. It doesn't mean you're not a good officer or a great officer if you lose sometimes. No one goes in the ring and doesn't get punched in the face. And they don't get a bloody nose. That's not realistic. And what you can't do is not get in the ring or get in the ring and just run around. You got to get into a scrap. That's what we do. And I just will never forget that discussion. I left thinking like, God, this guy took the time to do that for me. That was like great mentorship.
Why do you think he did that?
I think because he was a good person, and I think he thought about, okay, this guy's going, he's young, and he's going somewhere really intense. And maybe, so again, in that organization, sometimes people exaggerate, like you always get as you're walking out the chief's door, don't get caught or don't F up. That's not like that's not the greatest advice, I guess, to someone. And so back to your question, I try to tell my officers, look, like we got your back, because the best people I worked for were like, when you get hit the street, it's all you. You're going to make the call. You don't get a call. You don't get the phone call like the lifeline. Mm-hmm. There's no radio you can call back, and you got to make a decision. That's the thing that's very special about the job. And someone's life may be in your hand. You may have a ton of money with you, some technical stuff, whatever. But when you get back here, no matter what call you made, I got your back. Okay, I'm empowering you. I trust you to do what you got to do. And, the best bosses I had were like that. And I try to do that for my officers and let them know that you're not going to win every game.
I mean, he must have seen something in you to have brought you to his house, like out of that training, and not just gone into the class with other people probably in the same pipeline as you.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he knew I like beer. I don't know. No. He's still with us, thank God. And he was a great mentor, and a great personality.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing about the agency, I'll say, like, we had a lot of great characters.
That's true.
A lot of like just weird, unique characters, which I never found. Like when I was at INSCOM, there was some of that. But in the agency, it was, especially in the Directorate of Operations, it was, just people with strange languages, strange skills, quirky, but unique. And when you get like on the street with them or in the field with them, it was just fun to be around them. So about diversity, like there was a diverse intellectual diversity that was kind of amazing to be around.
One of my grad professors was Burton Gerber.
Yeah.
I don't know if you I assume you had spent some time with him at some point, but also quite a character and very high up, in the agency in Russia and whatnot. So I always just looked at him this is a character here. He operates in his own way.
Yes. And there were people that he kind of mentored and molded, and they were the same way. I do worry too. Sometimes we're losing that too. We become like very cookie cutter, maybe too overly bureaucratic. I had a friend who was another great, like just great linguist, really unique guy. He spoke like 9 languages. He was the son of a plumber who had just figured it out. He grew up in a small town in the Midwest, I think. But he told me once, he's like, I wish we could make the misfit team. Because, in the agency, there's a lot of people that don't fit into anything, but they're just really, they have one little skill that's amazing. And when their time comes, like, that's the person I need. I need her because she's got this very unique skill, and let's throw her at the problem. And they can do incredible things for the country. But you have to tolerate them. And if the system isn't designed to do that, like you just want to stamp everyone to look the same, we tend to crush that.
So just for a moment, let's talk planning. This is something that I don't think people really understand. You mentioned going to very tough places. You've been to the hardest. There's a lot of planning that goes into just a regular day on the job there, where you really have to be detailed about what you're doing, where you're moving, what you're carrying with you. Certainly in the military, it's known for the planning side of things, but I just felt like that's one of the things people don't realize about the agency. Could you share any anecdotes or your experience on both sides, the person actually going out and executing, and then the person overseeing someone else's plan as you advanced?
Well, you probably remember from you're taught multitasking. They want to test you, like when you go through the training, can you multitask? Can you make decisions on a dime? You go out with one plan and then no plan survives like contact with the enemy, right? How do you react to that? Like, do you fall apart? Over time, like my wife and I argue all the time because we'll leave the house and we'll start going somewhere. She's like, "Oh, I forgot this." I'm like, "We're not going back." Like once you set out on that course, right? And I have the set way I'm going, and I got to go that way. I got to be there on time. When I travel, even now, I'm retired. Like I could have been a day late, but you can't miss a flight. You got to be there on time. You got to be there in that window. And you're constantly processing. And this is one of the things, even after you retire, which is a little difficult because you're never present for other people because you're constantly processing what's going on around you. The timing, timing hacks between here and here. What happens if there's traffic? What if I can't get a cab? What if this? How's that going to impact me? And it's so built in that you're doing it all the time in your head. And by the way, like where I was, you don't write a lot of stuff down because that's evidence. You don't want that. And then you're watching everybody all the time, and you're constantly like hyperactive. You're hypersensitive. You're sitting in Starbucks, and everyone else is chatting away, blah 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 blah. And you're in there like, okay, why is that guy doing this? What did he just put in his bag? Like, why is he holding his hand inside of his jacket? Like, has he got a detonator in there? Now, maybe the other people in Starbucks are all also retired agency and they're all doing the same thing. I don't know it. Maybe every Starbucks around the country. And if you listen to like the Russians, all Americans are CIA anyway. So maybe that's it. But planning is big. And then what people don't realize is the paperwork. How much I've written. When I retired, there was a think tank that, they were talking, they were like, have you written anything? I said, oh yeah, I've written like reams of stuff. And they were like, well, what can you share with us? You're like, as a writing example. I'm like, nothing. Zero. And they were like, well, what, like, but you said you've written stuff. I'm like, oh yes, I've written a lot. So you're a lot of paperwork. What they never show you in James Bond is the finance part of it, right? James, why did you use 2 bullets instead of 1? There's a new policy, the Aston Martini, you have to change the tires and you haven't done it. Okay. You spend a lot of time doing paperwork. The bureaucracy the red tape can be pretty heavy. It's Aston Martin, Bozo. Oh, sorry, Aston Martin.
Oh, I thought you were mixing it like the Aston Martini.
Martini, right. I said, that's the Aston Martini.
Them together.
Who you call a Bozo over there? Who is that guy? Peanut Gallery.
I will say that's one of the things I feel like a hidden talent that you get coming out of the agency is your ability to write something quickly, distill what's important and put it on paper very fast.
Yes.
I definitely didn't have it in the military, but the agency just breeds that into you, I think.
And briefing.
Somehow. And briefing.
And doing meetings, like doing fast meetings, concise. That's, I learned, especially like when you get to the more senior ranks, when you're going up and briefing the director or you're going to the White House, like sometimes you have like 3 minutes to brief a really complicated thing, and you have to like boom, boom, boom. And I had a boss that'd be like, we'd be going through like a prep session, and he'd just be like, "You're boring the hell out of me. Like, make it sharp." And he was a great boss. He taught me, like, you walk in that room, you got to like seize the moment, and you may have 2 minutes, and you better get your point across, because you either need an approval or you need to make sure that the principal is tracking so they don't get blindsided by something. Because if they do, no one likes a surprise. And it's a skill that you get at the agency.
I had a question here on what do people not understand about the agency. I think you just nailed it with the writing. Is there anything else that comes to mind? The things that they don't get to see when they're watching the movies or reading the books?
Well, also like the personal sacrifice in terms of like every 5 years, what happens. You can't have friends, that was hard. I like people, and I liked a lot of the people that we knew overseas, and, you would have to get approval to maintain friendships or contacts. And sometimes they would say no. And that really stunk. Right. And my wife and kids would be like, "How come we can't talk to so-and-so anymore?" I'm like, don't worry about it. Yeah. And there are people around the world probably think, "Oh, Glenn's an asshole," because like he never called, he never wrote. And most of them, it's not because I'm maybe I am an asshole, but I like those people. I just was not allowed.
Yeah.
So, and then
people in my college think I was an asshole.
Okay, well, we can tell that story too if you want. Or we can tell a story about when you came to visit me in a certain country and the surveillance guys couldn't.
Let's tell it. Let's tell the story.
So
you guys look alike.
We look alike,
right.
And Gavin came to visit me in country X, and the locals were like, I walked out of the building one day, and they had a guy at a booth watching, and you could see he saw it like he thought. No, sorry, Gavin walked out first, and he looked like, okay, check, like the target just left. And then I was watching him do it through a doorway, and then I walked out and I watched him like do a double take, and then he gets on a phone. Ah! What happened? They multiplied. Yes, so Gavin and I do look, well, he's better looking. Yes.
Yeah, don't sell yourself short on that. I agree. You look very similar. As much as you can say about this, I understand, very sensitive topic, but what I often talk to guys about, especially on the military side, is you have all these expectations the first time you go downrange, first time you go outside the wire, you feel like it's going to be World War III. Almost everybody universally is like, they just believe it's going to be a gunfight, and usually it's pretty mundane. When you think about maybe the first time you were running a surveillance route for real, do you remember kind of the emotions, the fear? What was it like?
Sure.
That time?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, where I got like, they just handed me something, said, "Go do this." And what you talk about the planning. When you're in training, you're given time to like plan. And what one of my instructors told me was like, "Hey, when you get to the real world, you usually don't get that choice. Like something snaps and you got to go." And that's why, like, when you need to know the place, like the area, the city you're in, you need to be able to move around. So you got to spend all your free time working in, like moving around, learning the city, learning, area familiarization. And where I went to my first assignment, I got somewhere and they were just like, "Hey, sorry, but we got to deploy like in an hour." And I'm like, bye-bye, bye. And then you're just out the door. And yes, your heart's in your mouth and you're nervous and you're scared. And by the way, to the very end, there were times when, I never, like, it never went away that I'm not gonna, like, fear that something's going to go bad. And especially when you work in certain environments where the locals are very good at creating cases, right? So double agent operations, being dangles, you have to always know that you could be on the wrong end of a very well-planned operation. And some services are very, very good at it. And of course, what we learned, unfortunately, after 9/11 is that non-state actors have become very good at it. And so, you've got to be super, super smart. And going back to your officers, making sure that it's part of their like subconscious, that they know if an opportunity comes, like how they protect themselves and the source. Because the golden rule was always like the source comes first. You protect the source. But after 9/11, what it became too is like, I don't want you walking into an ambush. There's certain things you have to do to make sure that you keep yourself safe. Because at the end of the day, like, I want you coming home to your family. And the challenging places where I was at were where things seemed okay, and then they would just go up in flames. And, people would get in a little bit of a lull, or like they felt lulled, and you should never do that. But it's very hard to sustain, like in some countries I was in, I'd leave on like R&R, and I would get sick 2 days, like immediately. My wife would go crazy because we'd get to we'd fly to Dubai. And as soon as we got to Dubai, I'd be like sick. I'd be lying in the...
To relax. This is your vacation, basically.
Right. And I'd be, for the first day or two, I'd be out. And one of our medical people told me, they were like, that's just your nerves, like your stress level. You're going down from 120 miles an hour all the time to now you can relax a little bit. And so your body like is adjusting. And that was for years like that.
How about after your...
And I would also get sick when my wife would ask me to do errands. And that was terrible.
Just happened.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, Give Legacy, and we'll get right back to this combat story. I was really excited to bring Give Legacy to our listeners. Veterans and members of the armed forces have twice the risk of infertility than the general population. Sperm health can be affected by lifestyle, age, injury, and environment, including exposure to toxic chemicals such as those in burn pits, radiation, and pollutants. Hundreds of men in high-risk occupations like police, firefighters, and members of the military use Legacy to test and freeze their sperm. This will allow them to produce biological children, even if the unthinkable happens. The military's healthcare system offers limited options for couples diagnosed with infertility and no coverage for proactive fertility preservation. Legacy is committed to supporting the military, veterans, and their family members. Legacy's special relationship with the military includes several partnerships, including free access to Legacy's privacy-protected at-home sperm testing with 1 year of complimentary cryopreservation service to all Naval Special Warfare operators and Green Berets, and a partnership with Operation Baby Foundation that provides grants of up to $5,000 to military couples diagnosed with infertility to assist with treatment, surrogacy, and adoption costs. You can find out more by going to www.givelegacy.com. That's givelegacy.com. Listeners can use the code Combat Story to get 10% off everything on the site. And now, back to this combat story.
How about after your first or second or maybe one of the early recruitments that you had, the feeling on the way back from that? And what happens in the office when you get back? I don't know, as much as we're able to talk about, but what's the feeling like there for this thing that you've probably been looking forward to and being nervous about for so long?
It's exciting, like when you can connect with somebody. And I always did believe that like you're opening up doors, like opportunities for somebody. And that's a great feeling. Back in the office, sometimes the tradition was you'd celebrate, right? Some places we're just too busy to do too much of that. As a manager, like as a leader, you try to do something special, just kind of celebrate and give people credit for what they did, what they achieved. But I was always too, like in the back of your head, like I got to make sure this person's taken care of. And there were many nights like I would go to bed and like, okay, to this day, I'm like, where is so-and-so?
Like one of your officers?
Well, no, like my agents.
Oh yeah.
Like, I hope they're okay. Like, I hope everything is fine. Because the rule is too, once you go, you go. You're not supposed to go back and ask. So
actually, could you speak a little bit about that? Because I feel like this is something people might not understand, but like how close you get to that person, and they might think it's adversarial, but it's not in many cases. And then you literally will never talk to them again.
Right.
And you're just cutting ties, like the emotional side of that.
Right. It's very emotional. It's very, again, psychologically can be very difficult. You build a bond. Many times you're in very dangerous situations together. You're going through very hard times together. And then you just part ways. And not only like you're not going to talk to them again, the way I was taught is you don't even go back and ask the people on the desk, how's so-and-so? Like, how's he doing? How's she doing? That's just done. Need to know, right? You just go, you move on. If you're lucky, later in your career, someone may come and say, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times you don't know.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to know. And you have to be very disciplined about not, asking.
Do you think there might be a time where you will see one of them again? Maybe they're out of whatever they were doing in a safe place.
I always hope, right? I mean, again, a lot of these, we used to laugh, like say someday we're just going to sit on a beach somewhere and drink a beer together without all this stress.
Fear.
Without fear. I don't know if that's realistic, but
Yeah.
I would hope. And honestly, like some of the adversaries I worked against too, I'd love to like sit down in the future with them and drink a beer, drink a cup of coffee. I had, a lot of respect for the people that were working against me. And in different countries, like I had a lot of respect. I got to say, like they were very good. They were very dedicated. Their job was to stop us, and our job was to do what we're supposed to do. And like, there was almost an honor among thieves. The surveillance teams, like I always tried to respect them and, understand like that's a hard job. It's a crappy job to sit in a car, in minus 30 degrees for 12 hours until, Glenn decides he's going to go to the store. That's not a fun life. And they're doing their job. Most of them, they're doing it for their country, just like we were doing it for our country. Sometimes I always thought it was a little silly, like our people would get very, make things personal or overly emotional. I could see on the CT front, right? Okay, like people that kill people, terrorists, yes. Like, I don't really have a lot of sympathy for them. Although what I saw on that side too, and I spent a lot of time in the CT world, is a lot of those people were just victims of like it's probably like anywhere like inner city, kids growing up without parents or going through, guys that I had the opportunity to chat with had, lost both parents in a bombing, raised on the street, and then how do they survive? They get involved in terrorism. They get involved in extremism. It's maybe the same thing with like narcotics traffickers. And so even there were some people that I really I felt for them. I had like a certain compassion for them. And of course, like the security services that worked against us, you got to take their hat off to them. Yeah. A lot of them don't have the money we have, the equipment we have, and they did pretty impressive things. And I learned a lot from them.
So it's funny, one of the guys who we've interviewed on this show twice, he was actually the first guy I interviewed, and it felt like I was in an asset meeting because that was how I just knew to set something up. But he was a former Marine who was in Fallujah as an officer, and then he was a PMOO. He was in MARSOC and then a PMOO. He's now an author, Elliot Ackerman. He writes pretty extensively. But he's written a few books, and one of them was called Places and Names. And I read about this, and then I had him on and we talked about it. So when he was out of service and writing, and he was reporting basically for the Atlantic and different places, he was in Turkey, and his fixer arranged a meeting between him and a former card-carrying AQ member in Turkey, actually right on the border. So he goes to it. At first, it's like he's not a Marine. He's just going in as an American journalist. And then they're all speaking through this fixer as an interpreter, basically. And they're talking for hours. The guy figures out he's a Marine, that he had been in Fallujah and all these different places that the AQ guy had fought. And he said, eventually the interpreter's like, I can't do this for much longer. I'm going to take a break. And he said that he and the AQ guy sat there with a napkin and they drew out the locations of places that they had both served and the dates to see had they ever been on the other side of the other guy. And there was just this respect, the same way you talk about. Yeah, I mean, he was obviously on the terrorist side from our perspective, but he was fighting for what he believed in. And there was that relationship that they had cultivated, basically just sitting across the table from each other, drinking tea in this case. So very, very similar to that sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very familiar, and you can understand why. Again, yes, for us, they're terrorists. For them, they had a different perspective, and they're defending their homelands, or they're defending their, whatever villages, or, and I felt like the best officers I worked with instilled in us, like, always respect the enemy, always respect like what you're working against. Never take them for granted. That's a big mistake we make a lot. We underestimate. It's a little country. They don't have a lot of resources. Never make that mistake, especially when you're on their turf. And that's the thing about being an operations officer. You're on their turf and they own the turf. And to survive, you need to understand and respect them.
Yeah. If I can ask about the post 9/11 changeover, maybe since you experienced both sides of it, of pre and post, all I knew was post 9/11 from like I joined the Army in 2002, agency, later in 11. So that was all I knew, but I had heard, hey, things changed, the pace of operations. Obviously, the target set changed. We were diverting resources. You got to see that firsthand. And then I don't know, like over, the next 10 years, did you see it swing back? Are you worried about tradecraft and the way it's implemented based on the post 9/11 era?
Oh, I'm worried, yes, for a number of reasons. I would say, one, I mean, I think there was a burnout at some point because we were working like crazy, right? And it probably was not sustainable. If you look, I mean, this is my assessment. Before 9/11, the hiring was not high. After 9/11, there were like major hiring, but there weren't enough experienced managers, leaders to manage and lead all the young people. And that meant they were throwing younger people without a lot of leadership experience into leadership jobs. And that's sometimes problematic. I think, people have criticized, okay, the war zone mentality or like the tradecraft on the CT side is different than the, let's say, traditional stuff or like, harder CI targets. There's some truth to that. And some of the mentality became, what I saw was the organization became very focused on how many people you managed. Like almost became like paramilitary focus. If you manage 1,000, 10,000, then you're a general. If you manage 3, then you're only a captain. But in the espionage business, it's a little bit different, right? And so you can only manage 2 people, but your impact could be incredible. If you look at the case of like the $1 billion spy and what they did in that station at that time, like the impact they had on the U.S. government was incredible. And it wasn't, thousands of people. Mm-hmm. So I think numbers became very important. And then, again, in a lot of those environments, languages were not important. And this is one of my critiques. I think the organization has lost its focus on language skills. That worries me a lot. I saw less and less of like the dedication to like really mastering foreign languages and using them. So, and I think part of that may be a product of, in the bigger places, the war zones, that just wasn't what was done. And, 1-year rotations, that kind of stuff was problematic for various reasons. You just don't learn the country. Most places I work, it takes you, even if you speak the language fluently, it takes you a year just to get your feet.
Yeah.
And so, 2 years is short, 3 years good, 1 year, is not enough, my opinion.
Do you see it swinging back though to a better state as you were exiting, in the more recently, or you feel like that kind of post 9/11 hangover has not changed what you just described?
I think this is my view. Like the whole country's going through a very difficult time right now, and I don't think it's gotten better.
Yeah,
I think the organization. By the way, like we've always traditionally turned to. Now you got to remember, like I was an operator, right, a humaner. But I get very frustrated. I hear, OSINT, AI, OSINT, AI, and like people love technology in this country. But I said this after 7 October, like Hamas did not publish their plans in OSINT, or if they did, just nobody caught it.
Yeah.
Right. So the human stuff becomes critical. And by the way, what I understand happened there was probably more of a strategic failure on the leadership of the Israeli services, right? Apparently the Israelis, that's what the media is claiming, they had intelligence on what Hamas was planning to do, but people dismissed it. And that's because, as my assessment, Hamas ran a very complex counterintelligence operation. And this is why am I talking about this? This is my big concern. I think we've lost the ability to think critically. Mm. Part of that is because nobody can be critical. Everyone's sensitive. Like this level of sensitivity is so high. When I was young, I would have bosses say this is not a good idea. Let me explain to you why. Like you need to think about this from 10 different angles, not just the one that you came at it with. And was I a little angry that they didn't like my idea? Sure. But did I was it the end of the world? No, you just get over it. You get back on the horse and you do your job and you learn, up until the end. And I had some really senior jobs in some of the hardest places and most significant places we have around the world. And I worked for a guy towards the end of my career who was legendary. And he would come to me and he's like, did you think about this? And I'd say, son of a bitch, like, how did I miss that? And I go walk to my car that night. I'm like, man, I'm such an idiot. Like, I've been doing this for all these years and I didn't think about this. This guy is like that much smarter than me or more experienced than me. And I got to learn that. And I go like, I'd write a note to myself, like, don't screw this up again. I saw a trend towards the end of my career where that's not acceptable. And my concern is that kills critical thinking. If you don't have critical thinking in the intelligence business, then you have like big problems. Yeah. And so I don't know how you get over that because it's society wide from what I understand. There's a trend right now in the country where there's a lot of difficult things happening. And we're just a reflection. We may have a fence around the building and badges, but we're Americans.
Still American.
Still American.
Just before we pivot on to Russia, last question on this side of things, I would ask, if you look back at your career, what is one of the hardest moments or decisions you had to make that you're able to discuss, even if it's obfuscated to some degree? But do you remember one or two in particular? It doesn't have to be the worst or hardest, but...
Hardest decisions. Well, a couple of things. One, like taking assignments and the struggle, like for my family, especially being away from my family. That was the worst thing, by the way, about my career. Like I hated being away from my family. And I was away from my sons. I was away from my wife, missed a lot of holidays, a lot of birthdays.
Have you counted how many years in total you've been away by any chance?
No, because it's probably impossible. I once tried to figure out how much time I spent wasted in airports and train stations and, waiting for people on street corners.
And then it got too depressing.
My 12th cigarette, and they're late, or I'm in the wrong place, which also happens. No, but like that was always hard, like making the decision to take certain assignments or take on certain obligations. Other things, like there was one point where I had to, I knew I was going to get in trouble with people above me, but I had to make a decision to make sure that the senior people knew something. And, I knew like I'm going to get hit by a ton of bricks, but I did it. And I got hit by a ton of bricks, but that's what your job is. You survived? Yeah, that's your job, right? I mean, I sort of survived.
Okay.
And then the last one, the hardest thing was probably just making a decision to leave, to like retire. Again, only because I felt so guilty about where the country is now and what the threats are. But I also felt guilty because I have two sons. I wanted to spend more time with them. I wanted to spend time with my family, my wife, who was, denied a lot of the attention she probably deserved and deserves. And then my other brothers, like their families, I was just gone all the time. And even if I was back, I was like back in the States for a 1-year assignment. I was so busy every weekend, every like late at night. I before my mother passed away, going to visit her was almost impossible a lot of the times. And it broke my heart because I wanted to see her, but I'd say, okay, like we're going to go this weekend. And then I'd get notified, okay, you got to go here, or, you're on duty. Something just happened. And so I guess what I'm saying is at some point I finally said, I just got to spend some more time taking care of my family and let other people do the job.
Yeah. All right, Glenn. So we kind of talked through your experience with the agency growing up, getting here. For people who may just be tuning in to listen to Thoughts on Russia, could I just ask you to share maybe a little the bona fides on your side, like the time you spent focused on Russia, Soviet Union, just to establish that off the bat?
Okay. I mean, probably since I was, freshman in college when I started majoring in Russian and studying Russian and Russian studies. And then that's what I did when I worked for the Army. That was my main focus. When I was with State Department, that was pretty much my main focus. And then with the agency, much of my career. So my bona fides, I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's anything. I spent a lot of time living in Russia. I'm very proud of the fact when I retired, like I had native, like when I finally tested like 5s. Like that was like,
Just for people listening, 5 is the highest you can get. That's
I was proud of that, right?
Yeah.
That took a lot of work.
Wow.
But what I want to say is like, and I have a master's degree in Russian language and literature. By the way, I love Russian literature. And a bachelor's degree in Russian studies. And I went to the Army Russian Institute, I told you, and like I spent a lot of time studying Russia and working in the former Soviet Union. But somebody asked me, they're like, you're a Russia expert. I'm like, no, even the Russians don't understand their own country. Like, I don't believe that if anyone tells you they're a Russia expert, I don't believe it. I don't like all these people that are out there say I'm a Russia expert. No, I don't go for it.
Well, if we can, let's start with the Russian people. As you kind of mentioned to begin with, you see them very differently from the government. And I just think let's start out on a positive note here as we talk about Russia, like your experience with the Russian people and how you see them.
It was, 98% of our experience, my experience, and I think I could speak for my wife and my kids, was a very positive experience. The people were very warm. They don't look like that. They have the facade, but when you get beyond that facade, they can be very warm people.
Well, you grew up in New York, right? So it's the same.
It's similar. Yeah, that's true. Like a little tough on the outside, but actually good people. Little crazy. Like they're more about the soul than the logic.
What do you mean by that? Like that's the kind of thing
they make decisions based on emotion. They're very conflicted. They have this famous thing like between like the Slavonophiles, people that see themselves as being part of Asia or Eurasia, and then the European. So there's this conflict in them all the time that I saw. The average Russians are like, they love America. That was the thing that always amazed me. Like most Russians only had great things to say about America. If they'd ever been here, they had good things to say. And if they hadn't been here, even people in the government that officially would say bad things, privately they're like, oh, like, Washington's a great city. I've been to the United States before. I have a cousin that lives in Miami or whatever. So they, and probably there's a reason a lot of them send their kids or are sending their kids to study in the US and live in the United States. So what I saw with the Russians is with Americans, they have this inferiority complex. They want to be treated as equals. They want to be seen as equals. I think one of the tragedies of the relationship is we were never people didn't understand that. Like when a certain US leader called Russia like the world's gas station, that was probably so insulting for them. I'm pretty sure that was very, very insulting, and it just made them angry. What used to make me surprised, like in the 90s, they would get pissed because they weren't in the news all the time in the United States.
And they wanted to be.
They wanted to be. And sometimes I would think that they were like teenagers, like they do something bad just to get attention from the United States. They wanted to be in the New York Times. They want to be in the Washington Post.
Where does that come from?
I think they look to the United States like they look up to America. They knew that America is a great power. America is financially successful. They're culturally, again, Russians would come here and they'd come back and like go back to Russia and they would tell me like, it's amazing. You can breathe freely. People are like, I had this one very senior Russian guy once who went to the United States and he was not a fan of the United States. And he came to the United States on a 2-week program, and he was living for part of that program 1 week in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he came back and he had like a stack, as before digital photos. He had a stack of photos he took from his time in Kalamazoo.
Just 1 week.
With this like middle-class American family living as their guest. And he was like, Glenn, these people are amazing. We would go to a restaurant. We'd go to like TGI Friday. Oh, and they would like treat every waiter and waitress nicely. Like they were kind to people. They were kind to me. They took me to their church. They took me to the state fair. I got to judge like the pig contest. This guy who was very sophisticated, and actually kind of sad thing afterwards, he told me, he said, my job during the Soviet Union, I was in the counter-American propaganda committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And he goes, and he had tears in his eyes when he told me this. He's like, I was saying things about Americans that I never knew. Like I was telling negative things to the world about the United States that are not true. Now I know it. And I had never met an American. I had never seen America. Now, like he said, I regret having ever done that because it was a great experience to see the United States and to meet so many like just average Americans. So I think that, I don't know, Russians, they're very mysterious. They're driven by emotion, and a lot of them feel a connection to the United States, and they feel a little bit shunned. Now, what's hard today is what they're doing in Ukraine is atrocious. I mean, the bombing of houses and, schools, hospitals, the latest round of strikes, energy infrastructure, dams, terrorizing, which is the way that they fight wars, is they're just trying to terrorize the Ukrainians into submission. So I can understand. And what worries me is that like the hatred among the Ukrainians for the Russians now is probably going to last for a very, very long time. And I hope that the Ukrainians get their land back. I hope the Russians stop this war. But even after that, there's probably going to be a serious challenge between those two countries, and for understandable reasons on the part of the Ukrainians.
Is there, I don't mean to bore the crap out of people listening, but I wonder, I think we as Americans might look at Russia in, all right, we have the Cold War and we have what's going on now. We have, the Soviet Union and Russia. Do you ever hear, when you were in Russia or meeting with Russians throughout your career, is there any time that they think back to maybe pre-Lenin or pre-communism that has any nostalgia or positive influence today? Or is that so far removed they can't even think about it, or they don't care to?
Well, that may be a lesson for the United States. I mean, a little commentary, but when Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over, and by the way, horrible people and horrible things what they did to the people of the Soviet Union, including the Russian people, they wiped away the history of everything before. They painted, if there was history to talk about the Tsarist times, it was propagandized and made to look negative. For example, the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, they painted them as being horrific, horrible. And if you look at the stats, the Soviet Cheka killed many more people, arrested many more people without trials than the Okhrana ever did. The Okhrana's way of work used to be they would arrest someone, then they'd either set them free. Of course, they try and recruit them and run them, or they would just send them to Siberia for a couple of years, or let them emigrate, like Lenin and a lot of the Bolsheviks. They let them go to Europe and live in Europe. And then, like, they didn't hunt them down and kill them like we see the regime is doing today to its opponents. So a lot of Russians don't know their history. Know.
Yeah, there's nothing.
There's an attempt by some people to say, oh, like during the Civil War, we sent the Russian fleet to Baltimore to send a message to the English because the English were debating whether they should join on the side of the South. And we sent, to Abraham Lincoln, we sent our support. And, we've had great relations in the past. The reality is, sadly, if you look at Russian-American relations, they've never been very good. There has always been a lot of tension in the relationship for a number of reasons. In the United States, there was always, before the revolution, people were very critical of the Tsar, human rights issues, civil liberty issues, probably competition, very large countries competing for influence. When the United States started to get bigger and more powerful, I think the Russians were concerned about that. And there's a great book out there. I forget the name of it, but it's about like it's somebody had collected all the letters that U.S. ambassadors or envoys, going back to the first envoy from the Continental Congress in 1775 to the Tsar's court. And one trend line is there. They all complain, like, we're under surveillance all the time. We can't get any meetings with senior Russian officials. They're sent, like, our household staff are all recruited by the secret police. They're stealing our letters and reading them. Not a lot of warmth in the relationship.
For those listening, if you heard about that book and you think that sounds interesting, the CIA is a good career for you.
Yeah.
If that turns you on.
Yeah.
So there's no like, hey, if we could just return back to that pre-communist era. There's no nostalgia.
In fact, what I saw with a lot of Russians, especially like people, I'd say like of the the Putin mindset, is their point of reference is to 1917, and then the Civil War, when the United States sent troops. We intervened in the Civil War. We supported the opposition to the Bolsheviks. The Wilson administration was supporting the opposition. And Russians to this day remember that.
They
and
remember it.
Oh my God, they've been telling me all the time, we never sent troops to U.S. soil. You had troops in Vladivostok, you had troops in the north of Russia. You and your English allies and your French allies were trying to undermine the regime.
Wow.
There was a famous case called the Lockhart Affair, where a British diplomat, together with an American and the French, the Bolsheviks claimed they were trying to kill Lenin and overthrow the government early on in 1917, 1918. Debatable on what they were doing, whether they were really doing that, but they were kind of meddling. This famous Sidney Riley, Sidney Riley, the ace of spies, although I don't think he was a very good spy because he got caught, but he was involved in a plot to try and overthrow Lenin. And so many Russians will look back to that and say, you fired the first shot.
Wow.
From the very beginning. Now, you could argue that the Bolsheviks were also inciting revolution in this country and in Europe, all over Europe. And we should remember that the Bolshevik goal, Lenin's goal, was not to stop in Russia. In fact, he was, when the February Revolution happened, he was caught off guard. He didn't think it would ever happen. And then he rushed back to take advantage of it, steal power from the provisional government, overthrow that government. And then they were trying in Europe, they created the Comintern. They sponsored revolutions in Europe, in Germany, in Hungary. They were providing weapons, and some of the same in the United States. There was a Bolshevik effort to create a communist revolution in the United States.
You'd mentioned when we started talking that we probably missed a window after the wall fell. Where is that window, and why do you think we missed it?
I would say 91 to 95, maybe. What I saw, the Russians were very open to engagement. Both sides are guilty of missing the opportunity. One, because corruption was so bad in Russia, my opinion, what I saw. Two, the United States was completely flat-footed, and nobody saw the Soviet Union collapsing. Nobody. Very few people, I should say. And the administration at the time, like the Bush administration, was very concerned about the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Clinton administration, in my opinion, was staffed by people that were not foreign policy experts. They didn't have a lot of depth on Russia. Because of the way that the Soviet Union was, there were not a lot of really, there were not enough Russia experts to go around. And what I saw in my first tour there was we didn't have enough people to try and understand that country. I hope, and I'll say this now, I said this before I retired, and I keep saying it, the U.S. government needs to be ready. The American people needs to be ready. And by the way, U.S. business needs to be ready. When the Putin regime ends, and it will end, when there's an opportunity again for a better relationship, we better be ready to take advantage of it and do it smartly. I saw Americans go into Russia. Some behaved in a really pathetic fashion.
Are you talking 90s?
Yeah. If they had $1,000, they were superhuman, and they took advantage of it in ways which I thought were disgusting. You'd go to the bars in St. Petersburg or Moscow, and there was, it was like Sodom and Gomorrah, and they took advantage of a lot of people that were desperate. Then there were Americans that went and they tried to do the right thing, but then the Russians would fleece them. Organized crime, corruption was rampant. I don't think that my own view is we should have been more patient with the Russians and understood, you're not going to go, and we probably saw this later in other places, like Afghanistan. We're not going to turn Russia into a democracy or a Western style, US style democracy in 10 years. Not realistic. So there's probably an alternative that we should have looked at. And at the time, which is interesting, a lot of Russians used to say to me, why are you pushing us to do that? And yet you're doing business with communist China, and you let them maintain, they did Tiananmen Square. You didn't end all business relations. You put up with that with the Chinese, but with us, you're demanding, complete market reform, elections like you have in the United States, we're not made for that. We've never had it in our history. So
how about in the post 9/11 / Putin era, I suppose, and please just correct me on this one, but it felt like, and I was so focused on Afghanistan and Iraq from 2002 on, but it felt like there was a period of time, maybe from 2001 to 2008 or so, where maybe we could have had more of a role or an influence or changed the trajectory we had maybe better relations where we would coordinate on CT something. And then it just felt like, obviously with 2014, with Crimea and whatnot, things changed drastically. Was there any more of an opportunity after 9/11 with some of the, I don't know, maybe support we could have gotten for America, or not really? We were kind of destined to where we're at now.
I don't know that it could have been much different once Putin came to power. I think because his goals and his interests were completely different than what we thought and what our goals and our interests were. The Russians viewed Afghanistan, the people around Putin, from what I saw, they saw, okay, the U.S. is going to Afghanistan. Really, the goal is to surround Russia and to destroy Russia. Why did the United States go into Iraq? To build bases in Iraq to come after Russia. Why are they funding all these colored revolutions? They refuse to insist that the Georgians or the Ukrainians might actually just want to have their own independence. And
all suspicion.
All suspicion. And like some of the most suspicious people I've ever met in my life. Maybe because in their own system, nobody trusts anybody.
Yeah.
So they definitely don't trust outsiders. And so they were on a different course. And they were very sensitive about our relationships with like countries in Central Asia, in the Caucasus. And at some point, I think Putin gave the order, like, cut the legs out of the Americans from underneath them. And my own view is people in Washington were so focused on the CT thing and the disaster, in my opinion, that was Iraq, that decision, just took everyone's attention away from it. And we just didn't pay enough attention to Russia for a long time. And we paid a price.
I think one of the battles that Russia fights in that time period where we're so focused elsewhere is with Georgia, right? This 2008. At the time, what were you thinking as that was going on? And it feels like it didn't get a whole lot of visibility because we were so focused in two separate fronts. What was it like on your end?
So I was in one of those very CT-focused places, but my hope was that people were going to realize, okay, this is a strategic problem for the United States. We've got to pay more attention and give more attention to this problem. The Russians are not going to go away and just do whatever we want. That's like fantasy. And there was a little attention, and then it went away again, right? 2014, Crimea.
Yeah.
Same thing. I thought, okay, now this should be a wake-up call. No, not really. And, I think that that's the fault of the machine in Washington that was very focused on other things. And people, there were people that would tell me, the Russians are our friends, like they're our allies. I
think that's what I may have heard. Like, oh, it's different now. They'll support us in certain areas, but no. I mean, if they were going to support us in certain areas, then we also had to modify our expectations and our policies. And we weren't willing, we didn't even, I think about it. And, the challenge with the Russians all the time is that they can't accept that the former empire is not their territory. And they used to talk about countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, that's our sphere of influence. And I would always argue, no, it's the sphere of influence of the Azeris. If they want us to be good relations with them, or the Kazakhs want us to be there. We had a military base in Uzbekistan. And if they wanted us to be there, that's their choice, not Moscow's choice. The Ukrainians, this is the problem, in my opinion, right now. The Russians just will not accept that Ukraine is an independent country, and they need to accept that. And it'd be shameful if the United States turns its back on the Ukrainians who are fighting for their independence. This is not anti-Russian. It actually would be to Russia's benefit if Ukraine were closer to Europe and an independent, healthy country with a healthy economy. The Russians would benefit from it. Why is that?
Because trade, business, like growth, integration,
yes.
Right?
Okay,
There are a lot of
right.
There are a lot of Ukrainians that their first language is Russian, right? That's the bridge to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But the Russians see it as a military bridge, like a Plattstorm for NATO and Europe to invade Russia. I can say I never ever heard once anybody say, "Let's invade Russia." The best story I ever had was one of my guys that worked for me when I was there the last time. He's from Texas, from a little town, Texas. And he came out to visit his son and his daughter-in-law. And he told me, he said, Glenn, he said, I hope, that was my bad Texas accent. He said, Glenn, when I got to the border, the Russian border guards are always like sullen and not always the most friendly. And he said, I got the motor gun. There was a young man. He kind of gave me a scowl. I gave him my passport, and he said, what is your purpose for visiting Russia? And he said, well, I'll tell you what, son. I did my study of history, and I know I'm not here. My intention is not to make the mistakes of Napoleon or Hitler. I am not here to occupy any territory or take over your country. I'm here to visit my son and my daughter-in-law. I'll be here for 2 weeks, and I promise you I will leave in peace, and I will not try and take any territory with me. And he said this Russian kid smiled from ear to ear. He's like, welcome to Russia.
Was that my father-in-law? That sounds familiar. What would be, in your opinion, the opening salvo of the second Cold War, as you referenced earlier? Like, we've had the first Cold War, we've had the second. What would be the entry point?
To me, it was 1999 when.
Really?
Yeah, when we went into Yugoslavia, when we started to use force in Yugoslavia. For the Russians, if you remember at the time, Yevgeny Primakov, who was the prime minister, was flying to Washington. When we started the air campaign, he had meetings with Al Gore, as I recall. And he turned his plane around halfway and he flew back to Moscow. And they canceled the meetings. They had this famous Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission, the vice president and the Russian prime minister, this like bilateral commission. And he turned around and he went back to Moscow. And that was it. And that was the message that the Russians, like for years, we had told them NATO was not an offensive alliance. It was a defensive alliance. And then the Russians, Putin cites it to this day. You lied to us. NATO is an offensive organization. You went after our ally.
Wow.
Milosevic, who, I don't know that the Serbians really want the Russians as allies. That's a whole nother story. But that was the Russian perception. And I think that's where I saw, I will never, ever forget. I was in a car dealership getting my car fixed. And I was there in the company of some individuals whose job it was to always keep their eyes on me, like 4 of them. And the TV was on in the car dealership. And I remember seeing the first strikes. And they looked at me and they all just shook their heads. And I said to myself, this is not good, right? And honestly, I was a little bit worried, like on the drive home, like they're going to run me off the road and beat the crap out of me.
Wow.
Because the Russians were pissed. And right after that, we had huge protests in front of the embassy. The Russian reaction was very, very negative. They did not buy the reason that, that Washington had for going into Yugoslavia. They thought it was regime change. And I think that's where the new Cold War really started. And it just kind of deteriorated for years.
Were you in Russia at the time? Or if you can't answer, I'll edit it out.
Yeah,
so you got the full brunt of that effectively. I thought I remember from that air campaign that the Russians helped talk, was it Milosevic at the time, off the ledge, basically like just
they tried
give
to.
in.
They tried to. My remember, like I wasn't a Yugoslav expert, but my understanding is they tried to. But Milosevic was his own man. But then they were like really upset. And we had these, I can tell the story, we had these very, very large protests at the embassy. And like we had to evacuate the embassy and we put all the families on lockdown. So I was like one of the, what do we call it? Like you have to be on duty, essential personnel. And I called my wife and I said, like, I wanted to tell her, like, don't go anywhere. And, my wife's the kind of person who's like, oh, I want to go see these demonstrations. Like, don't go anywhere. But the maid answered. Her name was Tamara. And Tamara says, oh, Glenchik, listen, I have a plan. I'm just telling you, if things get out of control, I'm taking Leanne and the boys and I'm taking them to our apartment and I'm going to hide them there until things die down. And if I have to, I'll smuggle them out of the country. And I'm like, Tamara, what about me? She's like, oh, you're like a fucking Russian. Like, you're on your own. She's like, you're going to have to take care of yourself. Anyway, which, that I remember, like, that was the turning point in my mind where now you could say like earlier in the 90s, things started to go bad. And then of course there was a period after 9/11, maybe there was an opportunity, but on the CT stuff, people in Washington, a lot of the Cold Warriors felt that, the Russians were insincere, that they were using the excuse of 9/11 to go after the Chechens. And there was some of that for sure.
It felt like they did a good job with their propaganda. That's what they were doing.
Right. They wanted to paint all Chechens as terrorists, which is not the case at all. Many of the Chechens just wanted their independence, like the Ukrainians today, right? By the way, those people that argue that the Ukrainians should sign a peace treaty right now should remember what the Russians did in Chechnya after they lost the first war and how long it took them to start the second war.
This is a repeat.
A repeat. And the Ukrainians haven't forgotten that.
So one of the things that I think we're certainly taught at the agency, but I think anybody who studies Cold War or Russian history, like we're told that the Russians are great at propaganda. What's your take, having spent 30 years plus going up against them?
The Russians have a very good disinformation machine that's been honed over the years. By the way, it goes back to the Tsarist times. Many Americans don't know, but this, the famous protocols of the Elders of Zion were created by the Tsarist Okhrana, a false document that accused the Jewish people of having a conspiracy against, a worldwide conspiracy. They created that to take pressure off the Tsar for some of his failed economic policies, and to anger ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, and kind of let them blow off steam by doing pogroms against the Jewish population in the Russian Empire. Americans should remember that today too, when they surround like Jewish students in an auditorium somewhere and in a threatening way. Like, that's unacceptable. That was propaganda that came from the Tsarist Okhrana. So the machine goes back before 1917. The Soviets perfected it. But I will share with you my own opinion today. Okay, like the question, did the Russians interfere in the 2016 elections? Because for years, everyone took their eye off that. If you worked in the former Soviet space during that period, I saw it all the time. The Russians were working very actively to undermine the image of the U.S. and our relationships with people. 2016 comes and they came after us on our territory. They weaponized I'm here in Silicon Valley where, all the dreamers that created the internet and the, social media, and they were going to bring democracy to the world. That was a threat to Putin, and he weaponized it, and they turned it around on us, and they tried to use it against us. Now, that the Russians have meddled in our elections going back to 1917. Okay, they offered our candidates money for their campaigns. They put out disinformation against Reagan when he was running. They ran big disinformation campaigns during the Soviet times. There's a long list of things that they've done. They tried to stir up race riots in the United States in the 1970s. Okay, go through a long list. In 2016, what they did was no different than what they had done in the past. It was just the first time people paid attention to it. And I don't think they had that much impact, really, if you look at it. We are the problem. And I said this yesterday. I was speaking at a symposium. I'm not worried about disinformation today. What I'm worried about is information. We have given the Russians and our enemies too much bad information on the behavior of people in this country to use against us, right?
How do we give them that? What do you mean?
Poor behavior by our politicians and poor behavior by people in society. And if you tie that, then you add that to the multiplying factor of social media and the different platforms that are out there. People have lost, and if you look at the surveys, I don't have the numbers with me, but I had them yesterday up on the screen. People have lost confidence in the government. Like the level of confidence in the Supreme Court, of trust in the intelligence community, and trust in the federal government is at all-time lows. And that should be, and in politicians, and that should be a very much concern to Americans because, one of the goals in the 1924, a Russian OGPU officer wrote like a manual on how to wage war. And in the manual, his name was Turlo, Sergei Sergeyevich Turlo. And he wrote that like modern warfare doesn't just start when the battle starts. The battle starts in the information space. And the goal is to undermine your enemy's faith in its government, its politicians, to spread rumors, to play upon bad things that they're doing, to undermine further faith in the system, to undermine the economy. Everything that he talked about is happening today in this country. And the main catalyst for that is not the Russians. It's the American people themselves. And that's why I said our system of education worries me, because we're not teaching critical thinking. When I see people protesting in favor of Hamas, that scares me. And when you talk to some people and say, why are you protesting for Hamas? Or I saw someone recently, from the river to the sea. And someone asked him, what is the river and what is the sea? And someone said, the Black Sea. Okay, that's scary, right? It's kind of funny, but it's kind of, so you're basically saying we're going to liberate Turkey, right? I mean, people don't know, but they're out protesting. They're out because it's, I don't know, maybe it was like in the 60s, it was a party, it was a way to be seen and they want to feel active, but they're not thinking critically. We're not teaching people to think critically. And again, I think the behavior of too many people is just unprofessional and not disciplined. And it's allowing our enemies, we're just giving them ammunition to work against us.
Why does that? I agree strongly with everything you just said, and your point earlier that Ukraine getting closer to Europe would be beneficial for Russia. What you're describing, kind of weaponizing information, or just us giving them information so it kind of makes us look even worse. How does that serve Russia? Because it would seem to further break these ties. So if you're a Russian, why is it like, well, that's great if the US is weakened? Why would they not see it maybe in the way we perhaps would, that it's an economic opportunity?
I think it's the mentality. I think it is, as long as it's bad for the other guy, and it could be bad for me, but we're all suffering. Like no one's going to get the benefit. And of course, I think the guys like Putin see the world in a zero sum, like it's a zero sum game. Yeah. So if they lose, I win. And there may be some truth to that, but there's also cases where, like if you look at Europe after the Second World War and the integration of the European economies, there were a lot of benefits for a lot of people, right? Going back to Americans, what I can't understand is like the self-loathing I see in this country today. Like we have a great country and we've done a lot of great things. We've made a lot of great progress. Were we perfect? No. Do we have problems? Yes. Can we fix things? Yes. But does that mean that it's almost like civil rights never happened. It's almost like, every American's a racist, no matter what group they're from. This identity politics thing is out of control. And again, what the goal is of any enemy that wants to undermine us is to divide and conquer, separate. And I've never seen it like this before in my career. After 34 years, especially coming back home, I was like, what is going on? How can people be so angry at each other when so much was done to try and make things better? And I think we made progress. I was very proud when we elected an African-American president. I was overseas at the time. I was like, okay, this is what America's all about. Like, yes, do we have a problem with racism? Yes. But we also made progress. But apparently wasn't enough.
You mentioned earlier Putin's motivations. I'm curious how you would portray those now, and have they changed since maybe the late 90s very much?
Oh, it's a great question. I think they've become like his anger. That's just my assessment. Putin was one of the guys that he watched the Soviet Union collapsed. He was part of that system. He was part of the elite, like the Praetorian Guard, right? He was a KGB officer. He was told, like a lot of Russians were told, this is the greatest empire in the world. We're on the ascendancy. The United States is a decadent country. Western Europe's decadent. It's all going to collapse. Our socialist system will prevail. And then out of nowhere, it just collapsed. They watched it collapse. And I always use this analogy. You ever see the movie Falling Down with, I think it's, who's Kirk Douglas's son? Michael Douglas. Falling Down. It's a movie about a guy in Los Angeles. He loses his wife and he loses his job all in the same day. And he's trying to get home. I think his car breaks down and he's just like this very angry guy and his world is just falling apart. And that's what I saw in Russia in the early 90s. A lot of people like that. And people would tell me like, all the ideology that we believed for 70 years was a lie. And we don't know what to believe in anymore. And the United States became for them like a threat. And Putin definitely wanted to he said like, one of the worst things, maybe the worst thing that's ever happened is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he wanted to rebuild some kind of empire. I don't think he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. I think he wants to rebuild like a Russian empire. And of course, they don't care about, like the Ukrainians don't want to be part of that empire. And I always made the argument, and I believe this, we should tell the Russians, you do what you want in your country. Like we shouldn't meddle in your country. Don't meddle in ours, we won't meddle in your country. But your country is not Ukraine. Your country is not Latvia. Your country is not Georgia. Those countries are independent. And we, the United States, if they want us to help them defend them, we will do it to the last man. Because if we lose this fight in Ukraine right now, it's going to be a terrible thing for the United States, in my opinion, for all of our children.
Why do you say that?
Because we'll lose credibility. because we will embolden other people like Putin who think they can just take territory from others. We will have failed like a country that reached out for help. We'll have turned our backs on them. And if you put it in very base terms, like, where we grew up, if the three of us went into a bar and a gang came in and jumped you and we turned around and walked out, that would be pretty lame, right? That's not what Americans are supposed to do. We're supposed to stand by people that are in need. And we should be standing by the Ukrainians. By the way, the Ukrainians are not asking for Americans to go fight and die in Ukraine. They're just asking for financial help, which we have plenty of, and for weapons to protect themselves. And how we can't overcome this hurdle right now in Washington, I mean, I understand why, the mechanics, but we've got to get over this. It's not going to be good for the United States. Our countries, just think about this. We, in 1994, the Budapest Accords, we guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty together with Russia, right? I think in France and Great Britain. We failed. They gave up their nukes.
Yep.
And now Ukrainians are saying, why did we ever do that?
Yeah.
If you're another country, this is my personal opinion, but if you're another country around the world and you see what's going on, you say, I can't trust the United States, that umbrella anymore. I better do it myself. And that concerns me, right? So
I'm going to ask you about Navalny, but I'm going to tee up a question for after that. So the question I'm teeing up is, what is the event that would have to take place to remove Putin or seriously destabilize that place so that he's not in power anymore? So just putting that to the side, obviously Navalny's killed not long ago, or he dies. I want to talk a little bit about that, but obviously that wasn't the catalyst that was going to change everything. So I want to spend just a moment on Navalny, like your thoughts on it. How surprised were you, if at all, that it took this long?
yeah, I'm surprised that it took that long. That raises a lot of questions. We shouldn't forget Navalny. He was also a Russian nationalist. He said a lot of things which were unacceptable, let's say, for the Georgians. He supported annexation of Crimea, right? He's very unpopular in Ukraine. When the White House invited his wife to come and sit next to Navalny's widow at the State of the Union, I thought that was a big mistake because the Ukrainians were not happy about it. And of course, Zelensky's wife didn't come. I'm personally glad she didn't, because Navalny was a very controversial character. What the Russians have done very effectively is destroy any opposition. That's what I was saying before. And like most Russians I would talk to when I was there, my last tour, they just don't have any hope in the politics. They would say, like, we don't like Putin, but what's the alternative? There's nobody else out there. And he's done that deliberately, like all dictators do. They knocked Stalin did it. Anybody that started to rise up in the ranks and see effective, a threat, knock out their legs. So I don't know, like, what is people keep asking this question. Again, if someone's out there that knows the answer, more power to them. But I don't know. And the way Russia is, it's a mysterious place. It may just happen tomorrow. It may not happen for another 100 years. There have been periods in Russian history when people just snap, and then you have a revolution, you have a lot of violence.
Who needs to snap, I guess, in this? Is it older mothers of soldiers who are getting killed in this fight?
I think it's the people in the security services and the armed forces.
They just have to say enough is enough.
If you remember in 91 when they had like the coup attempt, and then, when they were outside the White House and Yeltsin, the famous scene where he got on top of the tank, and the troops that had been ordered to fire on the crowds, they went over to the revolutionary, or to the crowds, right? To the Democrats. And Yeltsin was a hero, and that was the end of the Soviet Union right there. You have to have, in my opinion, an event like that where people just say enough is, and it's gone too far.
People are out. There's a crowd, and the power kind of
either that
no.
or people around Putin just say, like, we've had enough of this. We don't want to be tied to North Korea for the rest of our lives. Like, and by the way, in the 2000s, when the Russian economy was doing relatively well because of their oil wealth and their natural resources, the Russians were traveling all over the world. They were, traveling to Europe, traveling to the States. I'm sure that many of those, like the elite, if they haven't left Russia already, they're angry They're not happy that they can't do the things that they were doing before. Now, I think like the key is for the average Russian people to just say, okay, we're tired of this. We're tired of having no heat. The question I have is, Putin came to power, we go back to the 90s when there was chaos in Russia, and there was chaos. And he was that iron hand. He promised them stability. He promised them order. And he delivered that probably up till 2014. Now, this is my opinion, his aggressive policies towards his neighbors have started to undermine that. And, what the question is, where's the stability in three guys going into a concert hall and shooting people up? Right?
Yeah.
The troops, they were going to the jails and recruiting criminals, rapists, murderers, and sending them to fight in Ukraine. Well, guess what? A lot of them come home. And they were given amnesty, by the way.
They had to make it a year, right?
They had to make it a year. And they go home, and there have been cases like incidents of like violent crime are on the rise in major cities in Russia. That, the energy infrastructure is not doing well. There are shortages. So I don't think like it's great for Russia either. And that's my question. What has Putin delivered to the Russian people? What greatness? And was there any indication the United States was going to invade Russia? No. As a matter of fact, I say this too. I wrote an article about this. In the 90s, we pumped so much money into Russia to keep it from collapsing. So when he claims that we let Russia collapse, or we wanted Russia to collapse, or we wanted to divide Russia and destroy Russia, it's the opposite. We kept him afloat. If it were not for the United States and supporting Yeltsin in the 90s, Putin would probably still be somebody, I don't know, he'd be an insurance salesman in St. Petersburg or a retired government employee. So we didn't destroy when we had the opportunity Russia. We may not have made all the right decisions in our relationship, but we did not try to destroy Russia. Quite the opposite. And that goes back historically. In the 20s, when they had major famine after the revolution and during the Civil War, we sent in billions of dollars of aid to help feed people. The United States, during the Second World War, Lend-Lease.
Yep.
So this paranoia that the United States is trying to destroy Russia, no, I don't buy it. And the other thing I used to tell the Russians all the time, I'm like, if you look at history, I can only think of one country. I'm not a great historian, but in the Second World War, our two major enemies were Germany and Imperial Japan. After the war, we occupied both countries and we helped rebuild both countries. And now they're our major economic partners and competitors. And we enabled that. And we gave the countries back to them, right? We don't tell the Germans what their policy has to be. We don't tell the Japanese what their policy has to be. And I used to tell the Russians in the 90s, just be patient. Like, let Americans invest here. Let us do our thing. Because one thing we do know is like business and industry. And you'll get your country, like in 20 years, 30 years, you'll be running the factory. Your kids will be running the company. And,
everybody's better off.
You'll be buying, remember in the 70s, like the Japanese were buying car plants in the United States. And like, that's the way it worked. That's the way a market economy works. And
Same
the Russians,
thing with Vietnam. Yeah.
Yeah, same thing in Vietnam. So like, what did we do that proves to the Russians that we're that evil? I don't know.
Maybe last question on this, possibly spicy. I don't know. You talk about maybe there's this event where the people are there, the security services, decide to not engage or take a stand. Is that something you think we could influence or even should influence? Or is that we just have to hope that people have enough in Russia and we can't really accelerate it?
1990, I was in Dresden after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but I was with a group of guys from the Army Russian Institute, and we were in a park in Dresden. And we ran across a Russian guy who was a Soviet citizen at the time, but an ethnic Russian, and he was backpacking through Eastern Europe. And he was an older gentleman. He was an engineer, and we started talking to him, and he was saying, like, the Soviet Union's coming to an end. Like, we have major problems. And our job was to study the Soviet Union, right? So I said to him, yes, like, things are not looking good. And I said to him, what should the United States do? And his response, I'll never forget it. He said, don't do anything. Just be America. Be the symbol of hope. Be the symbol of goodness that I grew up like dreaming about. Don't try and get involved, because then we'll just react the opposite Like, we'll get angry and we'll push back. That's because that's who we are. But just be that like ivory tower that I used to like get little glimpses of that motivated me to dream about like freedom and democracy. And I think we've lost some of that. Like, we got to stop meddling and telling people how to live and just do a better job here. In terms of like Putin, not Putin, I will say this. We need to stop dreaming or hoping that Putin's going to disappear tomorrow. He may be around for a while. He could do the Fidel Castro. What we need to do is we need to help the Ukrainians get their territory back, secure their country, and not worry about what happens in Russia. It's my personal opinion. Can we influence it or not? I don't know. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we won the Cold War. The CIA didn't win the Cold War. The DOD didn't win the Cold War. The Pentagon, the Defense Industrial Complex, they all played a role. But what won the Cold War was American culture. And I remember being a student in the Soviet Union in the 80s. Like, that's what people were focused on: Levi's jeans, Playboy, MTV. I'm like those students. They were so focused on it, and just like this dream about America. That, I think, is what we need to get back to. And it goes back to the self-loathing thing. Russians would probably ask themselves, why would we want to? And by the way, this is one of the things Putin wants them to say. America's chaotic. Americans don't love their country. Why should you look up to their country? Right? Americans don't respect each other. Why should you respect Americans? What alternative is that to what I gave you? At least I give you stability. And I'm defending you from chaos. In my opinion, we need to get back to a place where we like love our country and we show the rest of the world we respect you and your cultures, but we also have a great culture, and you can be a part of it if you want. If you don't want to, fine.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you're writing a book. Can you talk a little bit more? What's it about? What's the impetus behind it, and how can people pre-order it?
Oh, well, first I have to get it published. So if you send me $9.99 and you get a chia pet. Chia. I'll probably get in trouble for doing that, like a trademark.
I don't think so, but I think a lot of people won't even know the reference.
That's right. Sorry about that.
But it will be cool, so you're going to want to pre-order that.
You get a toaster. Yeah. No. The book is about just my stories of dealing mainly with Russians during my time in Russia. And it's not political. It's more just silly stories about like some of the things, experiences I had with Russians. Kind of, I don't know. Some of them are funny. Some of them are touching. Some of them are pretty sad. I'll give you one story if I can.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So 1997, I got in a cab. Russia at the time, everybody used gypsy cabs. Like, you stick your hand out and anybody would pull over and give you a ride and you give them some rubles. And so I get in this gypsy cab, and there's an older guy driving the cab. His old little Lada. And he's cruising around, and he's like, I'm saying, okay, take me to the American embassy. And he says, oh, like, why? I go, because I'm an American. He goes, wow, you're an American? I said, yes. He goes, oh, do you have time? I said, time for what? He said, I have something I have to give to you. So I said, like, what? And he said, look, I said, yeah, I can give you like 30 minutes. I'm not in that much of a rush. And he's like, okay. Now, part of me, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, he's probably going to kidnap me or something. He was a little old man. But he drives to his apartment building, which is like 20 minutes away. And he parks his little Zhiguli and he jumps out, leaves the car running. He's like, stay here. I'm going to be right back. And he runs off. And he comes back down like 10 minutes later, and gets back in the car, and he throws it in reverse, and he starts driving, and he hands me this piece of like newspaper, something wrapped newspaper. He said, this is for you. And first I thought maybe it's a provocation, like maybe the security service is trying to set me up for something. I'm like, I shouldn't open this. And I'm like, well, whatever. It's this little old guy, and I don't know. So I open up the newspaper, and there's a wrench from the Troy Industrial Works. And I said, what is this? He said, I want you to send this back to the United States. I'm giving this back to you. And I said, what is this wrench? He said, let me tell you a story, son. During the Second World War, during the Great Patriotic War, I was conscripted into the Soviet Air Force. I was a mechanic here at Tushino Airfield. And I don't know if you know it, but Stalin only flew on American-provided Lend-Lease aircraft.
Did not know that.
And I worked in the unit that we serviced all his aircraft. And he said, the Americans not only gave us the aircraft, but they also gave us all the equipment to service the aircraft. And at the end, and like I had like aircraft I serviced, they were like my babies to me during the war. He said, after the war, when the Cold War started, Stalin sent a message that we're going to return all the stuff to the Americans because we don't need it. Like, we can make our own. So we were told, pack up everything. And our commander told us, if there's one item missing, you'll be shot. You're going to the gulag. So we packed up everything. We went through everything. We packed it all up. We put it on train cars and they shipped it down, I think he said, to the Crimea, and they put it on ships to send it back to the United States. Right? That was our doing this to the Americans. He said, we also heard that when the Americans got them on the freighters, they took them out into the Black Sea and they pushed them off to go like this to us. Like, we don't need it either. So, because I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what we heard. He said, but as I was being demobilized a couple of months later, I was going through my mechanic suit and I found this wrench.
Oh, he must have been mortified.
And he said, I was so scared and I've been hiding this wrench for years. I've been waiting for like the security police to come grab me for years. And I've thought about like bringing it to the American embassy to turn it over. But everyone knows the KGB watches the American embassy and I don't want to go to the gulag. He said, I had it at my dacha for a while, buried out there. And then I had to sell my dacha. So I put it like, I've been hiding it in my apartment. And he goes, please take this and send it back. And I want the American people to know I didn't steal their wrench. Wow. So I went back and I called Uncle S at the time. And I'm like, can you find this company for me? Let's send it back. And like, let's tell the story. But the company was out of business. It was in Troy, New York. So like those kind of little stories,
Yeah.
like, and it, like the emotion in the guy's eyes as he was telling me, and the fear in his eyes.
Is this all in Russian?
It was all in Russian. Yeah,
That's cool.
And he's like, you could tell the fear was palpable, that he was still worried after all those years that the secret police were going to come get him and haul him off because he made the mistake of leaving a wrench in his jumpsuit. Wow. Yeah. So a lot of little stories like that.
So
No
I guess
politics.
so people can't pre-order it, but I guess I would say if you're interested and you want to know, just shoot me a note in the description and we will forward it over to Glenn for when he's ready.
Yes,
send me your email and we'll make sure that you're on a pre-order
It's
list.
almost finished. I have to get it cleared by the agency. They have to approve it. They approved half of it.
Okay.
So now I just got to get it cleared. That'll take probably a couple of weeks, and then put it in order. Try and get it published.
Okay.
So any publishers out there interested?
Publisher.
What's
Yeah.
that?
I said maybe one of his listeners.
I said, any publishers out there? Give me a call.
Yeah.
1-800 Chia Pet.
I do think you should pair it up with a Chia Pet now. You might really send it to the next level. Okay, so there's two questions I ask everybody, and then I'll get you out of here. So the first is, and I'm going to modify this slightly because you probably wouldn't be able to answer this otherwise, but I always ask people, and it's usually vets, was there anything that you carried with you on missions that had sentimental value, maybe a good luck charm, something somebody had given you? Clearly, besides a picture of your younger brother.
Picture of my younger
which,
brother.
of course, was front and center.
Yes.
But for you, clearly, like you probably couldn't carry much with you. But was there anything that you did before you stepped out the door? Anything that you thought about, or anything maybe you brought with you when you PCS'd everywhere that was really important that you had?
Oh, great question. Yes, I have this on my necklace. I have a cross and a Star of David that my mother gave me years ago, and I always carried that with me. And then I have my wedding ring because, not because I want to hide the fact that I was married, but because I used to work out with kettlebells a lot, and the kettlebell like would catch the ring, so I couldn't do it. So I put it on my chain. But and since I've been married since 1991, I've never taken this ring off my person.
Wow.
The only time is when I had my appendix taken out, and apparently when I went under, the doctors did it because you're not allowed to have any jewelry. So other than for medical procedures,
Got it.
but for years I had it on my necklace, and I would always wear it.
That's cool. All right.
Yes.
And then last question, certainly with 34 years in, we didn't even dig into a lot of the stuff that obviously you're not going to be able to talk about for years, but a lot of the sacrifice that you did mention, the tough times, and a lot of time spent away from family. As you look back on those 34 years, would you do it again?
Absolutely. I mean, I would hate to see some of the struggle that my family went through again, but I would do it again, especially working with a lot of the people I worked for and with, and the mission we had, and the impact I think we had. Yes, sure. It was a great career. It was a great, if people are thinking about that type of job, it's amazing. It's, it's not without its hard points and its knocks, and, there were a lot of painful times too, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, I look back on it, people write books about and make movies about what we did. And the best thing was just the people, whether they were the Americans or the foreigners I worked with, not just, in CIA, in the US government, and then just other countries we worked with, and some of the assets that we had. They were some of them were incredible people. Even ones who were probably double agents, I still liked them.
Still liked them.
Yeah, they were still
Probably why
funny.
they were doubles.
I had some that had great senses of humor, some that I just learned so much from.
What was the most money you'd carried with you at one point? Let's not talk countries or anything. On your person.
A lot.
Okay.
A lot.
Fair.
A lot. And of course, I was always worried I was going to lose it and have to pay it back. Right? I wasn't worried
And the
about
paperwork
I
would
wasn't
have been
worried-
horrible.
The paperwork would have been horrible. Yeah, a lot. All over my body.
All right.
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much for taking the time
Thank
with
you
us.
for having me.
That
This
was
was great.
That was fun.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that combat story. It's not every day you get to hear from somebody like Glenn, who spent that many years undercover at the agency, 34 years in government service, going up against the Russians time and again. It is really amazing to hear. And what was even more fun, we had Gavin, his brother, here with us while we were recording, and he's a good friend of mine. And in between takes, they were chatting just about some of the crazy serendipitous things that happened. And one time they were both in a third country, didn't know it, and ended up at the same hotel and saw each other with some liaison folks around. So they couldn't really interact, but they look so similar. So I think it really threw people for a loop. But anyway, those are the fun things that happen when you're involved in various government service, as they both were, coming from a great family. Just before we jump into some listener comments, I wanted to ask you to please subscribe, comment, like where you can. It's all very helpful in helping us get in front of more people. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple, if you give us a 5-star review, it would be huge. And so I'd be so grateful. We also have a newsletter that you might want to check out, what we're doing, what's going on, some history, quote that we're thinking about, what we're watching. And it's combatstory.com/newsletter. And just a couple comments here. I'm going way back in the archives to 2 comments that really caught my eye. One was on the Daryl Utt video. It's from Tony Keast, and he says, geez, this is up there with the top combat story interviews. I've lost count of how many there are in that category, but it's like half a dozen. What a dude. This podcast absolutely has everything in it. Next level Homo sapien stuff. Time just flew by. I'm excited with the heads up about who's lined up for the future content, Medal of Honor wise. Thanks, guys. Bring this up for 2 reasons. Daryl Utt has a book that's coming out later this year. We hopefully will get him back on the show. He's such a selfless guy. He's been so great in connecting us with more vets to interview, and he's doing so much for the community. So I'd love to help him out, and I think we're all going to enjoy his book. And then also we might have another Medal of Honor winner on the show, hopefully by the time you listen to this. But if not, we're still working on it. And the second comment is another YouTube comment from Bill Burgart. And it's on the Mike Sorelli interview, and he says, I'm currently on a tactical team that has major voids in leadership, in reference to the attributes Mike talks about. I can only imagine the progress we'd make if we were all exposed to someone like him. So worthy of emulation, I'll be buying his book ASAP. Thank you for such a great interview and exposure. And Mike Sorelli continues to amaze. I think anything he touches just turns to gold. He's got a great documentary. He's got an ongoing podcast, book, company, just phenomenal guy. And for those who haven't heard him, he was a SEAL Team 6 or DevGru operator, both enlisted SEAL and then officer side. And he's a former Marine, like many of these guys who go on to great things. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's always great to sit down with another agency guy, especially a legend like Glenn. Hope you enjoyed it. And I hope whatever you're doing right now, whether it's wrapping up your weekend or hopefully getting out of the week, that you're doing all right, and stay safe.